Hello everyone and welcome to the new session of the Museum of Contemporary Interdisciplinary Program. This program provides accessible discussion on concepts, ideas, and contemporary practices in the broad interdisciplinary field of art, politics, critical theory, and also ecology, because there is a necessity to rethink the current environmental crisis and moving beyond the anthropocentric cultural and artistic frame. I'm delighted that one of the leading authors, original and influential philosopher today, Timoti Mортон, is our guest speaker. Timoti Mортон is a professor at Rice University. He has authored many books, including Being Ecological, published in 2018, Humankind, Solidarity with Unhuman People, published in 2017, Dark Ecology for a Logical Future Coexistence, published in 2016, Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World, published in 2013, and Ecology Without Nature, published in 2007. Along with other authors, Morton is a core member of the object-oriented ontology, philosophical movement founded in 1999, which proposes a strongly anti-anthropocentric reinterpretation of our relationship with the world and objects. His idea, such as the concept of hyperobjects or objects of such vast temporal and spatial dimensions that they defeat traditional ideas about what a thing is, has been widely accepted by artists, literary critics, and philosophers. Timoti Mортон's ideas do not refer to some conventional domain. Instead, they create a combination of distinctive characteristics of a new materialist ontologies: climatic, geological, planetary, cultural, and so forth. The title of his talk tonight is Wisdom and Love. Timoti, please.
Hello, everybody. It's a huge honor to be working for you this evening. I'm talking to you from Houston, Texas, where, as you can see, it's still the middle of the day. There's some sound around me. If the sound gets too much, I'll go inside. But so you guys let me know if it's too much. But it's okay for me right now. Anyway, yeah, the title of my lecture is Wisdom and Love, and it's been occurring to me recently that, we don't really know what the word philosophy means very much. I would never have described myself as a philosopher, actually, until the poet Gary Snyder read one of my books. And he read the book and he said to a friend of mine that this was a philosophy book. And I thought, gosh, it's very interesting. I would never have thought of myself that way. Maybe I thought it was a little bit arrogant to call myself a philosopher, but also just, growing up in a lineage more of talking about literature where the thing called theory was the thing that you were supposed to do, it never occurred to me to think of myself as doing philosophy. And when I started to write a little bit more deliberately about philosophical issues, it soon became obvious that it seemed like the point was to have ideas. And very kindly, our host mentioned one of those ideas, which is the hyperobjects. Now, I'm going to try to persuade you this evening that actually having ideas isn't the main point of philosophy. In fact, the main point of philosophy is, and this is going to sound maybe stupid because it's just a translation of the Greek words that the word is made out of, the love of wisdom. And you think of that in a very superficial way, I think. But really, the two words, how do they really connect, love and wisdom? Is it the love of wisdom? Or is it the wisdom of loving? Or is it something more like wisdom in love, which is the title of the lecture today? Or loving in a state of wisdom? I think I'm actually going to go with wisdom in love. And I'm going to try to explain why I think philosophy is really wisdom in love. Of course, many people will agree that actually wisdom there was a recording stopped message and I just heard it. that wisdom, the love of wisdom is all about really having ideas. I will try to dissuade you of this. Sorry, there's a few messages coming in. It's hard to concentrate. Anyway, what do I mean by philosophy isn't really about having ideas? Well, let's just think about what an emotion is for a moment. If the word philosophy is made up of two emotions, love and wisdom, what is an emotion? Well, again, in the word is this feeling of movement. Something is moving, something is happening. There's some kind of process happening. And I'm pointing kind of here, actually, which is, I think, where one would traditionally point in any culture, to a feeling. And it's connected to this notion of being alive, which is neither a biological concept of life or a legalistic juridical concept of life. If you want the Greek words for that, I suppose you'd say that the biological concept is bios, and the legalistic juridical concept is zoe. The kind of life that I'm talking about is actually characterized by this Greek word thumos. And again, I'm pointing here because thumos is palpitation. Yeah, it's actually in the word rhythm. The last syllable of the word rhythm is this word thumos, and it kind of means core, but in the sense of the pulsating core of something that's already moving. You know, when people talk about emotion, that's what they're fundamentally talking about. They're not talking about something that's necessarily going from A to B that has some kind of a goal. You can have an emotion without acting that emotion out. Even the emotion of anger isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's when you act it out with some kind of aggression that it could be a bad thing. Anyway, love and wisdom, two emotions. And maybe the whole idea is that you're driving down the street of wisdom. This is how I feel about philosophy right now. We're driving down the street called wisdom. And on either side of the street, there are these traffic signs, and there are lampposts and lights and things that you can see on either side of your vehicle, whether maybe it's a skateboard, maybe it's a car, hopefully it's an electric car. You're driving down the street of wisdom, and if you concentrate too hard on the things on the sidewalk, you could crash, actually. You could wrap your car around the lamppost if you concentrate too hard on the lamppost. The interesting thing about driving, actually, is that when you get good at driving, you kind of forget that you're driving. It just sort of starts to happen. And this is both true phenomenologically, as we like to say, that your world kind of disappears when you're involved in it. But it's also true neurologically. In fact, there's a lot of things in phenomenology, the wonderful, for me, philosophical view that kind of started to really get going in maybe about 1900. There's a lot of things in that view that are actually very related to neurological facts as we know them today. And one of them is that when you're very good at something, your brain stops working, actually. You don't need to think to do something. You sort of are thinking when something's going wrong. When there's a malfunction in your world, something's going a little bit wrong. Then you're thinking. Our world in general, our biosphere is malfunctioning right now very badly. And so we are doing a lot of thinking. And wouldn't it be nice to get to a point where we didn't do so much? Because actually, of course, is thinking really the true essence of what philosophy is. You know, thinking is how you might achieve something true. Yeah. And the feeling of thinking is a thing that Immanuel Kant calls the sublime. But you use thinking to get to the truth. The truth also has a kind of feel or a feeling to it. It's the feeling that Immanuel Kant calls beauty. I love Immanuel Kant's way of talking about these things. And in particular, the way that I like to think about the world, which is the object-oriented ontology, has an ancestor in Immanuel Kant, because he was the person who made it possible to understand why the modern world, the scientific world, is a world where all we have access to are data, things that are given. That's a Latin word for things that have been given. We don't have access to the things in themselves, we have access to data. And so scientific fact is actually, of course, an interpretation of data rather than some kind of authoritative claim or dictate coming from somewhere. Anyway, the love of wisdom, you're driving down the wisdom street, and the point is to drive, right? The point is not to get stuck. If you get stuck, the wisdom stops. Wisdom as opposed to intelligence, actually. Wisdom as opposed to having an idea. Wisdom is a feeling. The DOM part of the word indicates that it's a feeling. I think you'd have to say that if you had the choice, like I was saying, between wisdom as a set of instructions on a fortune cookie or wisdom as a feeling, if you just had that choice, you would go with wisdom as a feeling. And what is a feeling, really? What is a feeling? Or a feel, as we like to say now, if we're reading a lot of Facebook, talk about feel, which actually is quite a good word. I think beauty is truth feel, it's not necessarily got the kind of baggage that the word feeling has. So what are these things? What are these things called feel or feelings? Well, whatever they are, they're from the future, I think. A feeling is a thought or an idea that you don't understand yet. You don't know what that thought or idea is yet. Of course, feelings are obviously symptoms of things that have happened to us in the past. But the reason why we go to therapy is that we're having a feeling that we don't understand yet. And so there's this not yet quality built into the feeling. If you want to say it another way, the phenomenology of feeling is that it's from the future. It's like reading a poem. You're not sure what the poem means yet. Or it's like listening to me saying a sentence. You're not sure how the sentence is going to end yet. And so there is this quality of future when you're listening to something or attending to someone. And maybe a feeling is something that we're attending to, some kind of feel, but some kind of texture is happening and we're paying attention to it. So feelings are from the future, and in a way, feelings are ideas that haven't happened yet. Whereas ideas are from the past. Ideas are feelings that we've decided what they are. And so ideas are from the past, feelings are from the future. In the recent past, maybe recent, 2013, I published this book called Hyperobjects about these things that are really, really big and really massively distributed in time and space. And it's really hard to see all of them all at once. And they're sort of, as was said, they defeat our ideas about what an object is, There's some kind of ungraspable quality to that that's very obvious. And nowadays, I don't think I'd write this book. Of course, it's great to have a word. The fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin. And this guy sows gold, creates gold for the princess. And he has some kind of power over her. But once she figures out his name, Rumpelstiltskin, she's got the power. It seems important to have a word like hyperobject to describe something like global warming, because then we've got some kind of power. It's nice to have a word that's just one word that even makes you feel a little bit smart when you say it. And it certainly made me feel smart when it popped in my head. But it popped in my head as the result of a feeling process, right? I was kind of visualizing to myself all the styrofoam in the whole world. What is that? I was writing the book called The Ecological Thought. It was the book that Gary Snyder said was a philosophy book, and I was writing this book and just thinking, what is all the styrofoam in the world at all? I mean, for 5 minutes, it's a cup, right? It's made of polystyrene, styrofoam. And you crush it and you throw it away. And then for another 2, 3, 4, 500 years, it just sits there in some kind of landfill. Maybe it crumbles into little pieces and all kinds of interesting, nasty chemicals flow around. What is that, right? Like all of that, all the time. It's not just cups. And so this word started to occur to me, and it was more of a feeling at that point. I started thinking, well, what is this? What is this thing? And that's why I wrote the book Hyperobjects. Now, I think nowadays we don't really need the hyperobject word, because we've got the hyperobject feeling, and that feeling is called coronavirus. We've got this thing happening in our world, and it's everywhere and it's nowhere. And you can only see like little instances of it at a time. You can see people getting sick and dying. You can see people wearing masks in public because they don't want to hurt other people. You can't directly see the whole thing all at once, because it's this planet scale thing, and it's made of this tiny, tiny virus. All the things about coronavirus constitute what I would call a hyperobject. And we've got that feeling now, right? Like there's this thing that's sort of, it's in my body, and it's on all the surfaces that I'm touching. And kind of I'm part of it, right? I'm inside that space. I'm part of lots of different hyperobjects, of course. I'm part of what I like to call humankind. I'm a member of the human species. And that is also a hyperobject, right? And I'm part of the biosphere, and the biosphere is also a hyperobject. This hyperobject doesn't have to be a bad thing. It just has to be a thing that's really, really big. Not so big that it goes on forever. Just very, very big. It's finite, but it's very big finite. And I think actually on that subject, art that explores the finitude of things, but not scaled to the human being anymore, is really where it's at in contemporary art. In other words, if you're watching this and you're interested in art, I think the way to go is beauty rather than the sublime. Beauty, but scaled in a way that isn't to do with human beings in particular, but can include other life forms as well. So one of my friends, Tom Wiscombe, is an architect who works in Los Angeles, and many of his projects involve gigantic beauty rather than some feeling of the sublime. Sublime is the feeling of thinking. Yeah, the beauty is the feeling of true. It's a very interesting, magical feeling that maybe I'll talk about in a minute. But let's stay on this notion of wisdom in love. I don't think I'd write the book Hyperobjects anymore. And in particular, it's because not only do we have the hyperobject feeling, which is much more important than a word, but I don't think it's my job as a philosopher to try to produce concepts that are right in particular. I think it's my job rather to model feelings and to, as honestly as I can, go through them in print and in as slow motion a way as possible, so other people can also understand, maybe identify with them, maybe not. But in particular, I don't think it's worth frightening people anymore. We've already got quite enough fear in our world. We all know what's happening, whether we agree with it or not, whether we want to do something about it or not. We all know that the world is bursting into flame all around us, and also it's being inundated with water. And fairly soon, and this is the one that scares me even more than the flames and the water, we're going to run out of food. The real truth of the global warming is that you're not going to have any more food to eat fairly shortly. And that's the one that's frightening me. What happens when we start to run out of food? What do we do to each other when that happens? And so I'd like us to be ready in our feelings when that starts to happen, because no amount of ideas are going to work at that point. We better be prepared in here quite thoroughly, I think, at least some of us, to help others to be prepared. What's the main feeling I'd like people to have? Well, I think first of all, let's just start with the basic feeling. It's called panic. Panic is a word that comes from the Greek word for everything. It means everything. Right? Panic is the feeling that everything is happening. I'm writing a book with a friend of mine called Nicholas Royal. He works at Sussex University in the UK. And the book is called Everything is Happening. I don't know about you, but for me, 2020 was the year in which this feeling of everything's happening at the same time really started to take over. And in a funny way, of course, it's amazing that it's called 2020, because we talk about 2020 vision, perfect vision. And in a way, that's the thing that started happening in my personal life, as well as in my professional life, and in my life as an embodied being living in a biosphere. There's something to do with the coronavirus lockdown, when things slowed down or stopped or just hesitated for a minute. And you sort of see in the gaps there many, many different time and space scales happening. You begin to realize that what you do affects things 5 minutes into the future, a week into the future, a year into the future. You start thinking, when is the vaccine coming? You start saying, I'm not going to go to the supermarket around the corner. I'm going to save lives today. I'm going to care for people that I don't know, and I'm going to take care of people in the future who I may not even meet. I'm going to take care of kids that I may not even know. And these are the feelings that are required, aren't they, for working with global warming? This feeling that actually we aren't the center, and that time is not a dot, and that actually there are many, many times all kind of intersecting and overlapping. It's the kind of thing that you know if you're a scientist. Everything has a feeling to it, right? Everything has a feel to it. Hammers have a certain feel. You have to hold them a certain way in order to hammer in the nail, right? The tennis racket has a certain feel. Your car has a certain feel to it. You know, you feel it, and then you can drive it nicely. And becoming a scientist, you know, there's like an emotional reason why you would become a scientist, and it's a combination of all kinds of things, right? It's curiosity, fascination, ready to be amazed by things, ready to be slightly scared of things, actually, or even horrified, or maybe even disgusted by things. Ready to be wrong, right? Ready to be, I know that what I'm thinking is correct, but I can't believe it. So on the one hand, ready to be thinking, well, maybe what I'm thinking isn't correct, but also thinking, I know what I'm thinking is correct, but I don't understand why. It doesn't make any sense to me, but it's true, logically true. Both of those things are very important, and the whole world could use a lot more of these feelings. And I feel like my job right now is to encourage people to feel this way, to feel like a scientist, or sciencey, as they say over here in the USA, to feel sciencey without needing to pay to get a degree in science or to know complicated mathematics. I think everybody can have this feeling. And in fact, I think some forms of art have really modeled this feeling for us. The strange combination of fascinated and amazed and ready to be wrong, and surprised by the fact that you found out, you know. In fact, I think that the mid to late 19th century, fin de siècle, Paris, was the place where people figured out a lot of this. It's called aestheticism. It's the sort of allowing into one's life beautiful things, and also things that are maybe seen to be disgusting or too much pleasure. Maybe disgust is just too much pleasure rather than the opposite. Maybe the problem is that we keep on trying to make all of the disgusting things into beautiful things. That's a contemporary art tactic. Or maybe to make all the beautiful things into disgusting things. That's another kind of tactic. And then, of course, in politics, to police disgusting things. You know, phenomena like homophobia are about policing things that people find disgusting. This would be why Oscar Wilde was so key as an activist in his period, but also why he was an aestheticist. Right, he was ready to embrace things that could be conventionally perceived as bad or disgusting. But that doesn't mean that he didn't have any morality. That means that he had a expanded morality, and that actually truly evil in this world would be about trying to reject the disgusting thing in advance. You know, truly evil would be about trying to police the complicated, ambiguous feelings that come from accepting a number of different possibilities into one's life. So I've decided recently that actually my comfort zone is late 19th century aestheticism. It's a pejorative term, isn't it? Like the word anarchist is a pejorative term for a communist that Marxists don't like, and the word Gnostic is a pejorative term for a Christian that Catholics don't like. So in the same way, art for art's sake, aestheticism, it's supposed to be divorced from morality, but really it's another kind of morality. And it's based on another kind of pleasure, which isn't about going from A to B. The utilitarian theory of pleasure is that it's about getting something more than the previous. And that's good for you, to have something more. But I think we need to redefine pleasure here to include something that's not about accumulating something, not about adding something, but it's something more excessive than that and something more risky than that. I think that this combination of kind of phenomenological chemicals called aestheticism was really strongly developed by Charles Baudelaire, actually, in Les Fleurs du Mal, in the Spleen poems, in the middle of that book. In those Spleen poems, he'll say something like, "Oh, I'm covered in nasty stuff, and there are all these vampires living in my cupboard, but that's okay. It's kind of cool, but it's kind of disgusting that I think it's cool, but it's kind of cool that I think it's disgusting, that I think it's cool." There's this oscillation between enjoying and disgust, which is called ennui. It doesn't necessarily mean boredom. Boredom's maybe a rather too low resolution JPEG of what Baudelaire is trying to describe here. He's trying to describe a kind of oscillating between enjoying something and being grossed out or disgusted by it, and then like kind of enjoying the grossed out and being grossed out by the enjoying of the grossed out. So there's no settling place. It's a movement. I think this is how we find a new way of living, where we're not trying to exit from taste altogether by performances of disgust, and we're not trying to simply become the kinds of objectified things that something like consumerism tries to sell to us all the time. As it were, the Andy Warhol approach, where you're just sort of accepting that you really are a product, and the kind of maybe romantic approach, where you're sort of disgusted by the world. Both of these things aren't quite enough, that really what we require is something in between. This is what's going to somehow enliven in us a truly ecological sensibility, a sensibility that is beyond simply thinking that human beings are the center of the universe. And this might be also what being in love with might really mean. That wisdom in love might mean the willingness to encounter things that appear to be strange without trying to delete the strangeness. I think that might be a good way to describe it. So ennui, funnily enough, this is the science feel, ennui. You talk to a geologist. I was once talking to a geology PhD in Exeter in the UK, and she was saying, well, you're holding a rock in your hand, and this rock, you suddenly realize, you're a 20-something PhD student, and you're looking at this rock and you're going, oh my God, this is a billion years here. I have to suddenly be responsible for this. I'm not just any old person holding a rock. I'm actually now a geologist, so I have to be responsible for a billion years. And everybody who does it feels this strange feeling of vertigo, that all of a sudden a huge different temporality opens up. And in order to do that PhD, they have to kind of become big enough inside to accommodate this temporality and to be okay with it. This temporality that seems to swallow up their human existence into this vast billion-year-old thing. And they do it. They're capable of doing it. This is the good news about human beings, I think, actually, which is that we're not Pac-Man. We're not these negation monsters who go around just eating the whole universe to understand it. We're more like chameleons or or octopuses, we can take on the colors of the surfaces that we find ourselves on to some extent, right? Maybe not forever, but maybe to some extent, maybe enough, right? Maybe we can take on the colors and the values of the things around us enough to be able to let them in and work with them nicely. So that's a geologist, or imagine being a physicist. Imagine you're an astrophysicist and you're thinking about a black hole, and you're going, wow, that's probably the most terrifying entity in the whole universe is a black hole. But, you know, it's kind of amazing at the same time. It's an amazing thing. And amazing or terrifying, I have to be responsible for this black hole because I'm the physicist now, and I have to be accountable to people for concerning this black hole. So again, you know, I have to become big enough to allow this black hole feeling inside me, even though, you know, it's the most powerful object in the universe. Technically, would wipe me out in a nanosecond if I was anywhere near. So there's that one. My favorite example actually is the biologist who showed up on the radio in Houston last year, the local Texas news station, and he basically said, I was very moved, you know, I was crying actually. I was in the ocean and there was a sea lion mother, and the sea lion mother was loving on me, very affectionate. And it was beautiful. I was crying, but it was also disgusting at the same time. Why was it disgusting? Because the sea lion mother was feeding to me the dead penguins as a way of showing that she loved me. She was trying to feed me these dead penguins, and I found it really gross. But I was still able to somehow be there and appreciate this, even though it was gross. So again, this sort of science feeling here of allowing in things that may seem to be gross, that it is in fact, you know, potentially toxic for us, right? This is what gross means. You know, bitter and gross, they're physical sensations that newborn babies make this face that we associate with eating bitter things, because bitterness is a signal of the poison. But without a little bit of poison in our lives, where would we be? So, for example, you start a relationship with somebody, you fall in love. And again, this is relevant to the notion of wisdom in love. So what are we in love with? We're in love with something that could be toxic, actually. That's what we're in love with. You think to yourself, is this person going to be the toxic person who finally just makes it impossible for me to have a relationship with anybody because they're so toxic and difficult? They'd ruin any possibility for me to have a relationship. Well, if you try to find out in advance, you can't. It's going to be over. You know, you try to interrogate the being in advance to figure out if they're safe or not. Then, unfortunately, there's no way without creating some violence. And we're seeing this play out throughout the world now with all the fascism that's happening around advance. If the beings who come in are going to be toxic, there's no real ethically sound way to do that. You have to tolerate the possibility of this toxicity. Imagine that you're a single-celled organism, because this notion of toxicity it's a science feeling, but it's also actually what makes symbiosis work, you know, and our biosphere is created in large part out of symbiosis. That is, that life forms coexisting in a very intimate way with other life forms. Okay, like, so say, for example, you are a single-celled organism and you are anaerobic, you don't breathe oxygen. And actually oxygen for you is poison. Oxygen for you is poison, and your world is actually being poisoned by the hyper object called oxygen. You created it, right? It's not the Anthropocene, it's the Bacteriocene, as it were. It's 3 billion years ago, and you and your fellow bacteria have created around you a toxic cloud of poison gas that's actually going to kill you. Anyway, you're floating through the ocean, feeling some panic actually about this, if you have feelings, and suddenly, boom, and something went in, right? Because you have a permeable cell membrane. That's what being alive means. You have a permeable membrane. And in that moment, something goes in and you think to yourself, if you are able to think, you think to yourself, oh my God, did I just swallow poison? Have I just poisoned myself? And, you know, you don't know. You can't know that in that moment. You cannot know, did I just poison myself? But 200-300 million years later, maybe, or longer, there are some, you know, simple plants and animals. And they're saying, no, that wasn't poison. That was actually an aerobic bacterium. And the aerobic bacterium was able to absorb all the oxygen in the environment. So that guy didn't get poisoned by the hyper object. And then, of course, that being evolved into a plant, because this bacterium inside turned into a chloroplast, which is able to photosynthesize and absorb the energy of the sun. And now there are plants. Or the bacterium evolved into the mitochondria, and then animals showed up, because animals are life forms that have their own little energy cells inside the cells. That's called the mitochondria. And it's coming from this symbiotic relationship between an aerobic bacterium and an anaerobic bacterium. But isn't art like that also, right? Art is something that affects you without you knowing what the effect is going to be. So fundamentally, the feeling of art is a feeling of toxic, right? Like you've been poisoned, or you might be poisoned. This beauty might be bad for you, especially if you hold on to an idea of active versus passive, which is also male versus female, which is also master versus slave. If you hold on very tight to this idea, which is really a medieval idea from Neoplatonism, then you're going to be scared of art, right? Because art is a thing that happens to you without your consent. Beauty is a thing that just happens to you without you consenting. Beauty is the feeling of true. Yeah, the equation suddenly works. You didn't consent for it to work. It just works. Suddenly it's like, wow, this is true. And this feeling of true is called beautiful. But beautiful really inside has a little tiny sliver of the poison, which is why, of course, art is always a little tiny bit death. Yeah, all the goth kids got it right. Beauty is death, but like in a homeopathic dose. So it doesn't really kill you. It reminds you of the fact of fragility, right? Beauty is a reminder of fragility. When you fall in love with someone, you basically realize somewhere in here, you know, maybe not at the front of your head, maybe in the back of your head, you realize, okay, one of us will be holding the other one when they die. Yeah, when you have a dog or a cat or a child, you sign up for this, right? Whether you deliberately or not, you're signing up for one of us is going to be holding the other one as they die. And I would like to say to that point, actually, that's a very beautiful, deep thing, and it's to do with how inside the feeling of true is a feeling of fragile, right? Einstein doesn't know that his equation lasts forever. He knows that his equation might not last forever, that he might be shown to be wrong 100 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, or maybe 2 weeks from when he's figured it out, E equals mc squared. He could be wrong, or maybe less right. Yeah, like part of the science feeling is realizing that true does not mean the opposite of false. It's like true and false are different, but they overlap a little bit. They kind of crisscross. And Newton gravity theory is still correct, but only up to here, right? As long as you're not going close to or past the speed of light, then Newton's equations still work, actually, to describe everything. It's just that Einstein's equations go a bit further. So it's like you've got two different types of true, and one of them is more true, one of them is less true. This is what we call modal in logic, right? Where you can be nearly right or half right or slightly wrong. Got to get used to this modal way of thinking, right? You've got to get used to a world in which it's nice to hear something like Pfizer vaccine is 95% effective, right? That's much better than the Pope saying Pfizer is effective, and if you don't agree, I will torture you until you agree with me. Because we're not living in the Middle Ages anymore. We're living in the modern world. It's had to do with science, but science actually has to do with the feeling of precise uncertainty, or, you know, maybe very, very explicit ignorance. You know, sometimes I say to my PhD students, you know, you're not trying to create something that's absolutely right. You're trying to create something that is very explicit about what it knows and what it doesn't know. And that's the goal. And so, yeah, the logic of beauty is that it contains this rather amazing contingency. But there is this quality of fragility, and also a quality of one of us is going to disappear first. You know, the famous Oscar Wilde thing that he said on his deathbed, where he said, you know, me and this wallpaper are having a fight to the death. One of us has to go first. This is always true, right? The beloved being may go before you do. You may go before the beloved being. And that's what the love is really about. And so I would say that wisdom and love must therefore intrinsically involve a quality of accepting that some things that can be known might prove to be toxic things, and that some things that can be known might end up being known without us consenting to that, that they just happen. And that what's the problem is the idea of active versus passive, that we put on this notion of consent, that actually really doing an action and consenting are more like listening to something, and that really acting is a bit softer than we like to think in patriarchy, and passive or passion is a little bit sharper than we like to think, because both of them are really made out of listening to or attending to. All you have to do to agree with me is to remember that if you were in a band or a choir, where doing an action was the same thing as listening or paying attention. You're listening to the music, you're listening to your instrument, you're listening to your musical lineage, you're listening to the other musicians in the band. And this is what action means when you're playing music, but actually this is what action means in general. We shouldn't be waiting around for some kind of huge, big revolutionary action that will decisively change everything. We should realize that little tiny changes and big, big actions are more joined up than the ideology likes us to think. And that actually maybe what is required of us right now is too easy, right? What's really required of us is that we drop a couple of ideas that never really worked in the first place. The one idea is that human beings are special and different than other life forms. And another idea is that human beings are superior to other life forms, or that human beings are the only life forms that matter, or that human beings are the only life forms who create their own world, which is the most silly one. Because have you ever seen a bird? You know, have you ever seen an ant? Have you ever seen a bacterium? I mean, all life forms by definition, in part, create their own environment. That's what they do. That's what called being alive is. And in the end, this life is not even just a biological thing, but as I say, a kind of oscillation, a feeling, which isn't necessarily going anywhere. Life is actually saying something true about the universe. Life is saying that the universe isn't completely always running down to zero, but actually there are little parts of the universe that resist or reverse the entropy. This would be impossible in a mechanical universe, but luckily we don't live in a mechanical universe. We live in a quantum universe. And in a quantum universe, genuinely new things can happen because it's not a machine. So, you know, therefore, by definition, attempts to mechanize the world, such as capitalism, which is an algorithmic process, are going to end up being very violent. Attempts to be omnipotent, like Facebook, are going to end up being very violent. Attempts to be omniscient, like Google, are going to end up being very violent. And that what is actually required is an economics and a way of thinking that is much more attuned to a notion of life that does not have to do with the concept of alive, or a legalistic definition of alive, but rather with this feeling The default form of art is called dance, because all art is about moving your body, right? You put a paint on the canvas, you say the word in the poem, it makes your body move. And the default dance is called being alive. Yeah, you get up, you brush your teeth, you go to the subway station. Maybe it's a rather boring dance, but it's still a dance. And the default alive is called being asleep, right? When you're asleep and your body is just going vum, 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 and your brain is going vum, 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 vum. Having the dreams. And this is the kind of life that is being talked about in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That's the life in Black Lives Matter. It's this palpitating, vibrant life that doesn't have to do with the law, it doesn't have to do with biology. It has to do with, could we please just not be killed when we're in public? In that sense, the phrase Black Lives Matter is from the future, because wouldn't it be great if they did? And I actually also believe that ending white supremacy and patriarchy are foundational, logically, to creating a more ecologically just world. And I think how we get there is by allowing our intrinsic, I would say, wisdom. I think we have intrinsic wisdom. I think our brains and our bodies have got a lot of wisdom in them that we should just simply tune into and not try to impose too many concepts on. And that actually wisdom in love finally means allowing as many life forms as possible to just live, coexist in a non-violent state without deleting each other so rapidly and so violently. Anyway, that's the end of my lecture, and thank you very much for listening. And of course, I'm very, very happy to take questions, and thank you.
Thank you for this fantastic talk, Timothy. I'm really impressed by your ideas. And so I will start with my questions. And the first is, when we discuss aesthetics or aestheticism, and when we usually give the name aesthetics or aesthetic dimension to an aspect of reality, which stuff happens, stuff like extension into space and time. And also you wrote that there is essential aesthetic dimensionality. It's a fundamental, at least at the scale of self-replicating molecules. So in this context, my question is how to consider aesthetics. Can we count as an inherent part of ontological processes, or is our cognitive or epistemological lens to approach the ontological ground?
Gosh, there's lots of words in there. So the first word maybe to get clear on is the word ontology. Mm-hmm. Ontology means studying how things exist. Okay, ontology is not the study of what exists. It's the study of how things exist. I'm going to leave what exists to science. Science is trying to tell us what exists. Ontology is saying, well, okay, maybe there are these things called atoms. Maybe there are these things called octopuses. If they are existing, how do they exist? Do they go on like this? Do they kind of flicker? How do they exist? What is the nature of their existence? That's the question that's being asked by ontology. And the question is really to do with where is the aesthetics in the notion of how things exist? What does it mean? What is the perceiving a thing or doing a thing? Why are they related somehow? Well, there's two things really to say as examples of how deeply down aesthetics goes. First of all, at a quantum level, when you see something, what's really happening is that a photon is deflecting another particle, right? So at that level, see doesn't mean something different from touch. Yeah, see and touch are the same thing. See and move are the same thing. Yeah, when you see something, you move it, which is why Heisenberg's equation is correct, right? Like you cannot directly see something that isn't moving. And we've got this idea, which is actually encoded into the very word idea, that seeing involves a thing that's already there, and then we see it. And it's got some kind of stasis. Yeah, but that's not correct. the word idea comes from this Greek word eidos, meaning a thing that can be seen. But really, things can't be seen that way, because when we see them, we are actually deflecting them or moving them. That's one way of thinking about this, that actually perceiving and doing are very, very much the same. Like I was saying, when you are in a band, when you're playing music with somebody, you know that perceiving it and doing it are the same thing. You're following along with the music, and you're listening to the other musicians and so on. Okay, so that's point number one. So point number two, the entire biosphere all around you, the sexually reproducing one, not the cloning one, but the leaves and the birds and the beetles and the butterflies and my shirt and this chair, because I'm a human being, I'm a life form in a biosphere as well. Everything that you can see around you, the way it looks, your phone, your computer screen, the food that you're eating, what you're wearing, the color of the fur of the dog, all that stuff is made out of female desire, all of it. It's all made out of, actually, even more amazing, it's made out of female desire with no goal in mind. It's made out of non-teleological female desire, not keyed to finding a mate in particular, and certainly not keyed to fitness in terms of being strong or having good chemicals inside you. In other words, it's made out of queer female desire. And whether this may surprise you, but actually this is what they call in science the null hypothesis. This is the thing that doesn't need to be proved. This is the default explanation for how our world looks. And it's in Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, when he's talking about sexual display, that actually, of course, some notion of beauty goes all the way down to beetles, at least, because those guys can have iridescent, beautiful wing cases. And the reason why is because some female beetle thought it was sexy. And they didn't think it was sexy for a particular reason. They just did. And so amazingly, beauty is hardwired into evolution. In fact, female desire is the evolution driver for how everything appears. And furthermore, there is something therefore excessive in DNA. It's not to do with having a point or a goal, but is in fact to do with randomness. Yeah, how can there be even random mutation? Well, like I say, evolution is saying something true about quantum world. There can be truly random numbers in a quantum world, numbers that don't require some complicated algorithm to pretend like it's created a random number, but a truly unexpected, truly random number can show up. DNA mutation, RNA, and so on, genetic mutation is totally random with respect to current need. So you've got this random mutation, and then based on that, you've got this subject, female, whatever that is, desire, queer, female desire, for no reason. And that's why the world looks the way it does. And that's the reason to care for this world. It's because it is in fact a kind of contingent miracle. Yeah. And any aesthetic experience should be telling you this, actually. Any time you have an experience of wow, that's an incredible work of art, you're actually doing something, and something's happening inside you. There is a deep resonance to some kind of extremely default aspect of being alive, of having a nervous system, of having some kind of consciousness that actually is going all the way down to the beetles. Possibly it goes down to flowers. These things evolved after plants did, but they're saying something true about plants, which is that they evolved randomly, and that the beauty of the flowers is actually purely contingent. This to me is the real reason to care for the biosphere, that it is a sort of miracle of pure contingency that is intrinsically, ontologically fragile. And so, what I'm saying sounds possibly weird, but actually it's just in line with contemporary science, contemporary meaning post David Hume. Okay, so since 1760, looking for the causes and effects of things has never been to do with opening the thing up and looking inside it. It's been to do with looking for the patterns that the thing makes and then studying the patterns and the shapes and the correlations between those patterns and shapes. And that actually cause and effect is like a aesthetic, in a way, interpretation of those patterns.
Thank you. So the next question is that in the 2013, you published Hyperobjects and Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World. So you anticipated that humanity had entered a new phase. So what has changed was our relationships to the non-human beings. So that these non-human beings were responsible for the next moment of the human history and thinking. So do you think that coronavirus and a non-human agency serve as a further proof to this anticipation?
I do, very much. There's the film Avatar. There's a moment in which one of the characters gets very excited that the biosphere seems to have heard the prayer of Jake, who is praying to Awa, the sort of divine spirit of that biosphere, of that planet. And she says, Awa has heard you. And when coronavirus hit, I started to think, Awa has heard you, because it's forcing us to have a planet scale awareness. I don't mean international, I mean planet scale. There's a thing I really like about the philosopher Carl Alonzi, who wrote a book in the late 1960s called Let's Spit on Hegel. It's a great title. And what she said was, the women's movement is planetary. It's not international, actually. It's a planetary, planet scale. And anything that can encourage us to kind of think on planet scale is super important right now. Is why I think Black Lives Matter and Me Too is super important, because they're making us think on a planet-wide scale. So yeah, we're being forced into a new way of thinking about ourselves by these non-human beings that are now showing up because of the violence that we've been doing to the biosphere. And now that the world is, bursting into flame and being covered with water and food is running out and all that stuff, we're beginning to realize that, human beings aren't actually the center, and that we're not, our job is not to eat everything down. A lot of people think philosophy is like eating the world. And that's not our job, actually. Our job is to try to become the world a little bit, to let the world in, and just allow it to affect us. And actually, it's much easier than we like to think. One of the questions that's often asked is, how can we do this? How can we accomplish this relationship? Well, it's already there, you see. We already have this relationship because we're biological beings, because we're products of evolution. We are already related in every meaningful sense to other life forms. All we have to do is to recognize that. And maybe we need to recognize that over and over again. But recognizing it involves something very simple. It involves removing some bullshit that isn't correct. Is actually very hard to maintain. It's very hard to maintain the idea that you're a separate, different being than all the other life forms in the biosphere.
Thank you. And my third and last questions, you have, it's a very in the concrete context. So we have collaborated with artists a lot, and it's a really interesting and effective way how to spread a complex idea to the huge audience. And even you co-created show Hyperobjects and exhibition to the ecological crisis. So to what extent do you think a work of art in general, this exhibition, but also a work of art in general, expand the scale of the human perceptions towards your ideas of hyperobjects and other complex concepts?
Art for me is the top level human activity. When you become an artist, you're basically allowing all of the other stuff that you do to be part of it, right? Like you could use the science, you can use engineering, you can use literature, you can use your historical understanding of things. All of these things can be part of your process. So when you sign up to be an artist, you're actually signing up to be on the top level. What does it mean? It means you're creating realities. That's what you're doing when you're an artist. You're creating realities for other people to study, also for other people to live in, right? You're creating reality. Therefore, what you're really doing is you're creating the future. You're allowing the future to happen, the real actual future, which is the possibility that things can be different at all. And I think, right now we're entering an age where shock and panic can freeze us and stop us from visualizing things. And so the capacity to visualize something, to just allow your brain to visualize, because it's a natural phenomenon of your brain, is very, very good. No matter what you're visualizing, the visualization power is extremely important. And I'm on the side of this power, which seems to be quite a spontaneous thing. So I say, for example, New York City, immediately you visualize it. You don't have to be there. You don't have to have gone there. And you don't say, well, okay, so there's First Avenue, and then there's the Alphabet City, and then it connects to the Statue of Liberty, and then blah, blah, blah. You don't actually build it up out of nothing. It's a feeling. Visualize, even if it's the wrong word. Sensualize maybe is a better word, right? And we all have this capacity inside us because we have a brain. And so, it's a feeling, right? New York, what a wonderful town. And that is the precious aspect, right? And so my job actually as the philosopher is not to put ideas in the art and have the ideas pushed by the art. My job as the philosopher is the other way around. It's to hold open the doorway for the art to come through, to allow the possibility that things can be different to happen in the world. And this possibility is itself deeply ecological, actually, and having to do with being a brain, which is an evolution thing, living in a biosphere, living in this amazing bath of interconnected life forms. I'm very much on the side of the brain these days. My idea of who I am is so much limited compared to what my brain actually is, and the capacities that it has. And maybe that's what we're actually alienated from, right? Is not some kind of divine essence somewhere in the cosmos, but actually simply our biologically embodied being that's always already there, but in a funny way, it's always the future, because we never quite know exactly what it is. So again, we experience it through feelings, and these feelings are the future. So again, I think, being an artist right now is very, very important. No matter what art you're doing, it's going to have an importantly ecological resonance to it because of the fact that it's being made by hands and brains and bodies in a biosphere.
Thank you so much, Timothy. Thank you so much for your great talk and this answer. Thanks a lot.
It's my deep honor and pleasure, and I'm deeply touched that you would invite me to this. And I hope that we can carry on the conversation. Email me. It's easy to find me online on Twitter and email. And so just write me, and we're connected because we shared something now.
Thank you. It was my honor.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.